Derek walked out of his bedroom, down the hallway, and into the kitchen with a spring in his step. He had one thing on his mind. Coffee, baby.
Daddy!
Shouted his girls at the same time in sing-song voices as he entered the kitchen, breaking him from his daydream. His daughters pushed back their chairs and ran to Derek, each embracing one of his legs.
Hiya, girls!
Derek said in a goofy voice. He knelt down and held them close for a massive bear hug. Suddenly, he let them go, rubbed his chin, and pretended to think with outrageous exaggeration. He said, overly drawn out.
I feel like there's something special going on, but I can't remember,
he said with a wink.
Pizza night! Pizza night!
His daughters squealed in unison.
It's pizza night!
He shouted with bravado and swung his index finger in the air, like an inventor making a great discovery. The girls squealed and kissed him on the cheek, then climbed back up on their chairs to finish their Honey Nut Cheerios. Derek sidestepped to his wife Veronica and grabbed her by the hip.
Hey, baby. What's the coffee forecast?
He kissed her on the cheek as she laughed.
On the counter in the Garfield travel mug.
But I hate the Garfield travel mug,
Derek whined, stamping his feet like a child.
Well, how about you don't get any coffee at all, mister?
Veronica said, pretending to be stern.
I'll be good.
Derek stammered in panic, raising his hands in surrender. Veronica giggled and kissed him on the lips.
Ew!
His daughters cried out.
Well, if you don't like that, then you're gonna hate this,
Derek warned his daughters. He dipped Veronica like a ballroom dancer and kissed her once more on the lips.
Ew, gross!
The girls shouted, snorting with laughter. He pulled Veronica up. Her eyes were sparkling and her cheeks red.
What has gotten into you today?
She smiled.
I'm walking on sunshine, baby,
Derek said, and dipped her for another kiss. Derek pulled the front door shut and was overcome with a sinking feeling that he'd forgotten something. He checked his pockets, confirming he had his wallet and keys. He had his jacket, and in his jacket pocket was his work name tag. He couldn't think of anything else he might have forgotten, but he felt like he was being watched. Then he remembered. Garfield. He had forgotten his coffee.
Son of a gun,
he said to himself as he turned to open the door. The doorknob wouldn't budge, no matter how hard he pulled or twisted. It was as if the front door had turned into a brick wall. He pushed the faintly illuminated doorbell and heard no chime inside the house. Derek knocked to no response, and finally pounded with the heel of his fist 3 times. There was no response. Derek was ready to slam on the door when his cheeks flushed. He realized how silly he must have looked. A grown man throwing a fit on his porch over coffee. He couldn't help but laugh. Derek walked to his car with an embarrassed smirk. There was no point in scaring the girls and pounding the door down at 8:30 a.m. Plus, he had time to pick up coffee on the way to work. And he hated the Garfield mug. He was about to put the key in the door of his off-white Toyota Camry when he saw an envelope tucked under the windshield wiper. He pulled it free and examined it. On the front, in ornate calligraphy, was his name, Derek. He furrowed his brow. The back of the envelope was sealed with a wax stamp. The wax had a strange impression on it, like a Christian cross, with a triangle on top of the crossbeam and a circle beneath. Its peculiar dimensions made the hair on his arms stand. He opened the envelope and pulled out a white card. On the card, in the same ornate calligraphy, was a single sentence in cursive. You have been replaced. An eerie feeling crawled over his skin, like a million cold taps of fingertips down his back and up his neck.
Some joke.
He tried to laugh, but he did not laugh. His voice sounded dead and cold. You have been replaced. He flipped the note over to see if there was anything on the back, but there was nothing. Just that single cursive sentence on one side. You have been replaced. The note felt heavy in his hands. It felt hot, like it was forbidden and blasphemous. Derek tore it in half, put the torn pieces back to back, and ripped again. He dropped them on the ground and got into his Camry. In line at the coffee shop, Derek had all but forgotten the baleful notes and the sinister atmosphere in the Camry. He was only thinking 2 words: mocha java. Derek deserved a treat, he decided. He was walking on sunshine, indeed. It was his turn to order. He was about to say mocha java when he had a sudden realization. It was pizza night. He slouched his shoulders and exhaled. A mocha java and pizza in one day. Now, that'd be pushing it a little too far, he thought. No. Today he would have regular coffee with a heavy pour of half and half. His mouth was already watering. Derek was okay with this decision. It would make the pizza that much better. The barista stared at him with her jaw clenched. She took a deep breath as if she was trying to calm herself by counting to 10. Derek raised his eyebrow, unsure of what to make of her expression. He tried to joke.
Medium rocket fuel with room. Don't skimp on the moo juice.
He said with a smirk. The barista bit her bottom lip and squinted. Her eyes betrayed shimmering rage. She said nothing. Derek waited for her to respond. She did not. A long silence hung between them. Derek croaked.
Medium coffee. With milk, please.
The barista put her palm on the counter and slowly clenched her hand into a fist.
Sorry, I said medium...
I heard what you said.
The barista interrupted him. Neither did she move. Derek drew a breath to repeat himself for a 3rd time when the barista turned and nodded to her coworker. The man's face was equally furious. In quick, severe movements, he filled a coffee cup, poured half and half into it, and slammed it on the counter. Scalding coffee spilled over the lip of the cup onto his hand, and he did not flinch.
Wow. Service with a smile.
Derek scoffed, shaking his head.
The fuck you just say to me?
The male barista barked. The air was sucked from Derek's lungs as he felt the fight or flight rush of adrenaline. The crowd stirred behind him. Derek turned to face the line. People gathered in a semicircle around him, fists clenched, like they were ready to jump him. They shouted all manners of rude aspersions.
Hey, hold on!
Derek shouted.
What's the deal here?
The line inched closer to him, menacingly.
Just pay for your drink and get out.
The barista at the counter said.
Okay!
Derek shouted at both the barista and the crowd. This calmed them, short of a few loud sighs. Derek pulled the drink towards him and took out his wallet. It felt strangely light. He opened the billfold, but it was empty. His heart sank.
I had almost $50 in here this morning.
Derek said to the barista, as if he had to explain himself.
Either pay, take your drink, and leave, or leave now without it.
The barista growled.
Just a sec. I can pay with a card.
Derek stammered. The line grumbled behind him, but there were no credit cards in the sleeves of his wallet. Instead, pieces of paper the size and weight of business cards were tucked in where his cards once were. Each card, in the same calligraphy as the note he found on his Camry, said, "You have been replaced." Derek swallowed hard. His hands shook and his palms sweated.
If you're going to fuck around, give me your coffee back.
The barista snapped. Derek read each card and flipped them over, desperately hoping one would say something different, betraying a joke. But none did. Each was identical, each with the same message. His mouth went dry when he saw his ID was gone. All that remained in his wallet were family photos in plastic sleeves, with the faces cut out. Derek's chest tightened.
That's it. You're done.
The barista grabbed Derek's cup of coffee, but he grabbed it back.
Just give me a second.
Derek pleaded.
Get the fuck out.
The barista seethed. A game of tug-of-war ensued. Coffee splashed on their hands, soaking the cuffs on Derek's sleeves. Specks of coffee splattered on Derek's white dress shirt. The barista was losing her grip, and the cup slipped from her hands. The cup flew towards Derek, and the lid popped open, showering him with boiling liquid. Derek cried as he reeled backwards. The shop went silent. Derek turned around, speechless. Everyone stared at him. One by one, people began to laugh. The laughter was deep and sinister. Their mouths were open and their eyes were wide. No one was smiling. Their faces were flat. It was not unlike the barking of dogs.
Stop it! Stop it! Stop it! Stop it!
Derek yelled. But this only intensified their demonic chant. Derek bolted to the door, throwing his shoulder into the crowd. He almost escaped when the door swung open, catching him in the chest and flinging him onto his back. His head bounced off the hardwood floor and his ears rang. He winced. Stars flooded his vision. When the stars dissipated and his vision steadied, he saw a man standing over him. The man wore a black suit with a black tie and a bright white shirt. He had piercing blue eyes and a flat nose. His cheeks were lightly pockmarked, and he had thin lips set above a cleft chin. The man smirked. He moved his foot forward and lifted his toes, pivoting on his heel. The man pressed down his shining black shoe against Derek's genitals with enough pressure to cause discomfort, but not enough to feel intense pain. Derek froze, afraid the man would push harder. The man gave one final push. Pain swirled in Derek's abdomen. The man withdrew his foot, relaxed, and put his hands in his pockets. Derek scuttled backwards on his butt and stared at the man, who smiled with his lips and cheeks, but not his eyes. Derek opened his mouth to speak, but no voice came out. Cheering erupted in the coffee shop. People hooted like monkeys and pumped their fists into the air. Derek looked around the shop wildly. No one looked at him. All were focused on the man, who was unmoved by the applause. Derek got on all fours and escaped the coffee shop. The morning sunshine was blinding. Derek held his work ID over the keycard sensor. He waited for the tiny light on the sensor to flash green, followed by the clanging of the door as it unlocked. The sensor flashed red and emitted a shrill beep. Derek waved his ID in front of it again. It beeped. The light flashed red. He saw Luis at his station behind the front desk. Luis pretended not to see Derek. Derek knocked against the glass. Neither did Luis stir. He pounded harder until Luis finally looked up. Luis nervously looked around the office, trying not to make eye contact with Derek. Derek pounded even harder. Finally, Luis got up and went to the door. He opened it a crack, pressing his shoulder against the doorframe.
What do you want?
He said, more a statement than a question.
I want to go to work.
Derek responded. The wet coffee on his chest had cooled, and it felt freezing against his skin.
You don't work here.
Luis sniped back. Derek clenched his fists and stood in tense silence.
Do we have a problem?
Luis asked, again in the form of a statement. Derek took a breath, calmed himself, then threw his shoulder into the door, knocking Luis onto the ground.
I'm calling security!
Luis shouted as he scrambled backwards.
We don't have security!
Derek barked. He stepped over Luis and headed to his desk. When he entered the cubicle farm, it went silent. People peeked over their cubes and sneered at Derek with a mixture of shock and disdain. Derek kept his head high as he walked to his station. Vomit rose to the back of his throat when he saw his desk. His cubicle, once neatly ordered, was in total disarray. His nameplate had been violently ripped from the wall, leaving a tear in the fabric. Papers were spread everywhere, and his chair was upside down, its legs missing wheels. His picture frames were shattered. Family photos lay on his desk, with the faces cut out of each of them. Keys were pulled out of his keyboard, and there was a small clearing in front of his computer. On his desk, in thick red lipstick, was the word pig. Tears welled in his eyes. He blinked them away.
The fuck is he doing here?
Boomed Bruce Siegel, vice president of strategy. He held open the glass door to his glass-walled office. Luis jogged into the room and shouted,
He threw me to the ground! He assaulted me!
I didn't!
cried Derek.
Bruce.
Derek stammered.
Don't you dare come one step closer.
Bruce ordered. Derek stopped, dead.
I don't know what's happening, Bruce. I didn't do anything.
Bruce puffed his chest and inspected Derek. He smirked with the corner of his mouth and moved to the side so Derek could see inside his office. It was the man from the coffee shop. He was sitting at Bruce's small conference table. He leaned back, with his hands clasped casually over his stomach.
You bastard! What are you doing to me?
Derek cried. Derek stormed towards Bruce, who clenched his fists and boomed,
Not one fucking step closer!
Derek froze. Bruce took a breath.
Gentlemen, remove this pig from my office.
2 pairs of strong hands gripped Derek beneath his armpits. Derek swung around and saw 3 men in black suits, dressed like the man sitting in Bruce's office. The 2 men held him tight. Derek turned to face his coworkers when the 3rd man gripped the back of Derek's head and pushed down, forcing him in a submissive crouch.
Out!
Cried Bruce. The men heaved Derek forward and pushed him towards the exit. The office screamed at Derek, throwing papers, pencils, and pens. A stapler hurtled through the air in a weird rotation and smacked Derek against the cheek. He shrieked in pain. The men pushed him through the door and flung him outside onto the cement.
Why are you doing this?
Derek stammered. The men remained silent and backed into the office. One pulled out keys and locked the door. In one movement, they turned and disappeared from sight. Derek brought himself to his feet and stumbled to his car. His cheek and head throbbed. He was in a state of exhausted shock and needed to rest his eyes. He arrived at his car, and the windshield had been smashed, with a baseball bat lodged in what remained of the glass. An envelope was tucked under the windshield wiper. Derek took it, cutting the heel of his palm without flinching on the broken glass. He flipped it over and saw the same wax stamp from the morning, with the foreboding symbol. In the envelope was a note, written in ornate calligraphy. You have been replaced. Derek dropped the note on the ground and climbed into his car. He crawled onto the seat and pushed it back. Derek curled into the fetal position, dazing off in a state of sleep-like shock.
Open up! Honey, please! Please not you too!
Derek cried as he pounded on the front door. Crickets chirped. Dew settled on the front lawn. Derek didn't know how long he had slept. He drove home in a daze, hardly able to see through the shattered windshield. And when he arrived to his front door that evening, his keys and his wallet were missing. He stopped pounding and rested his face against the door. He lamely slapped the wood with an open palm when he heard the deadbolt click out of place. The door slowly opened halfway. Blocking entry into the house stood the man. He had removed his black suit coat, and his collar was open. He wore no tie. He looked at Derek flatly and smiled with his lips but not his eyes.
You!
Derek shouted.
Honey, who is it?
Called Veronica from the kitchen.
No one.
The man called back in a calm baritone.
Veronica! Veronica, it's me!
A shriek came from the kitchen.
Get him out! Get him out! I'm calling the police!
She screamed.
Don't worry. I'll handle it.
The man said over his shoulder.
Make him leave!
Shouted his daughters behind the door.
We hate him! We hate him!
They screamed in unison.
Please! Please! You have to tell me what's going on.
Derek pleaded.
It's pizza night.
He whimpered. The man dropped his smile.
I'll tell you what's going on.
The man said. He motioned for Derek to come closer. Derek leaned in.
No. Closer.
The man beckoned. Derek was face to face with the man when he grabbed Derek by the chin. The man brought his lips to Derek's ear and spoke.
Tonight, I'm gonna fuck your wife.
He whispered. Derek's heart dropped into his stomach. Insane panic exploded in his head. The man brought his lips to Derek's cheek and kissed him. Searing pain split across Derek's skin as the man's lips burned Derek's flesh. Derek grabbed his face and reeled back, tripping off the porch and smacking his head off the concrete. The man cleared his throat.
You have been replaced.
He sneered. The man gently closed the door. The deadbolt clicked into place. Derek's shoes sank into the mud. He leaned down, untied his laces, removed his socks, and walked towards the river. It flowed steadily, cattails bent under the force of the current. He calmly walked into the river and stopped when the freezing water met his calves. He struggled to stand upright against the rushing water. In a bizarre, even-tempered motion, he leaned over and picked up rocks. One by one, he put them into his pockets, weighing himself down. He even put stones in his breast pocket for good measure. He took a step forward and struggled to maintain his footing. Water rose to his belly button, then to his nipples. He held his hands above the water and continued to walk. The rocks weighed his legs down so heavily that he struggled to move forward. He was up to his neck when a serious voice boomed behind him.
You don't have to do this!
Derek turned around with dead eyes. A stranger in a khaki coat with pressed slacks and patent leather shoes stood on the riverbank. He wore a fedora and blocky black 1960s-style glasses.
I do have to do this,
Derek replied. The stranger reached into his coat and pulled out an envelope.
You received one of these!
The stranger said, holding the envelope in the air. Derek didn't respond.
So did I! Ages ago. This doesn't have to be the end. Get out of the river. You're being ridiculous.
He said. Derek turned and waded deeper into the water.
This is your last chance.
The stranger shouted.
There are more like you.
Derek stopped. He stared across the river to the opposite bank. He had nothing left to lose. Trusting the stranger couldn't make the situation any worse. He reached into his pockets and took out the stones. Without speaking, Derek turned and faced the stranger. He gave Derek a kind smile and reached out his hand.
It's okay. Come with me.
Derek waded out of the water onto dry land and approached him.
You're soaking wet. Let's dry you off,
the stranger said. Derek fell to the ground and hugged the stranger by the knees. He wept, unable to control himself.
It's okay,
the stranger said.
It's okay. You're safe now. Come with me. I'm taking you somewhere safe.
The stranger pulled Derek up to his feet and led him away. The stranger cranked up the parking brake and got out of the car. Derek didn't move. Before them was a dilapidated house in a vast, abandoned industrial zone. Wood siding lamely hung at odd angles, falling off the facade.
Ain't pretty, but it's home,
the stranger said with his back to Derek. He turned when Derek didn't respond.
Hey, don't make me drag you out.
The stranger laughed. Derek mechanically clicked his seatbelt free and got out of the car. The stranger reached out his hand, offering Derek assistance, which Derek refused.
This way,
the stranger said. They walked up the front porch and into the house. A chandelier barely hung to the sagging ceiling. The hardwood floors were damp and creaked beneath their feet.
We have a room set up for you. First floor. Doesn't have a great view, but it's a start.
The stranger laughed.
We?
Derek asked. But the stranger didn't respond.
Right this way,
the stranger beckoned. He turned the corner into the kitchen. Dishes were piled high. Rust bore through the bottom of pans beneath a few sputtering flies.
Excuse the mess,
the stranger said. He stopped at a door and held his hand on the knob.
Here we are. Behind this door is a fresh start. Après-vous, monsieur,
he said with a flourish. He cracked the door and held out his arm for Derek to enter. He moved aside as Derek went through the doorway. The door led to a dark, stinking basement. Derek could only see the top few dirty concrete stairs before the staircase descended into blackness.
No!
Was all Derek managed to squeak. The stranger pushed Derek in the center of his back, hurtling him down the stairs. Derek's head hit the first step, and he was mercifully knocked unconscious as his body violently tumbled into the darkness. Derek snapped to consciousness with a wet gasp. His head throbbed and blood dried beneath his ears. Figures moved silently in the shadows. Fear overwhelmed Derek. He felt like he couldn't breathe. His eyes adjusted to the darkness, and the figures came into view. They were men. Men in varying states of decay. Some wore tattered clothes. Others were naked. One man stood with his back against the wall, his eyes scaled over with milky cataracts. They approached him, and Derek shouted. They froze, then backed away, muttering to each other. The men watched Derek in silence when the basement door swung open with a bang.
Heat!
Here, you animals!
The stranger's voice cried from the top of the steps. Wet globs of dog food flew from the top of the staircase and smacked on the concrete. At once, the men pounced and viciously grabbed at the reeking food, elbowing one another, pushing each other out of the way. They mashed their wet lips against the ground and ate off the floor like pigs, raising their arms in a feral display of dominance, grunting at one another like apes. Derek hesitated for a moment, but was overcome with a strange madness. Without thinking, he flung himself on the ground and scooped up the rotten meat. He shoved it into his mouth and drooled down his shirt. He pushed men out of the way, kicking at them, screaming. When the food was gone, the men looked to the top of the stairs, waiting for more. The door was closed. Neither did light trickle from beneath it. The men began to grunt like pigs in low, guttural voices. Derek joined in, snorting, his vocal cords tearing as he cried out. Derek did become madness. He would always be there.